Imagine a narrow strip of land sandwiched between the vast blue sea and majestic mountains covered with fragrant cedars. Imagine the smell of salty wind mixed with the tart smell of resin, the creaking of ropes, and the measured splash of waves against the rocky shore. And now imagine people for whom the sea has become not an obstacle, but a road to unexplored lands, to wealth, to immortal glory. Greetings, my dear listeners, and I invite you to write in the comments what city you are from and what time it is, because the story we are going to tell today unites us across millennia and continents. Today, we are going to travel to the shores of the ancient Mediterranean, to the place where one of the most amazing civilizations of antiquity once flourished on a narrow coastal strip between modern Lebanon and Syria. They were a people who did not build grandiose pyramids or cyclopean walls, but their name echoed through the centuries and has come down to us in the most unexpected forms. Every time we pick up a book, we touch their legacy. Every time we see the letters of the alphabet, we see their ingenious invention. These people called themselves by various names: Canaanites, inhabitants of Tyre or Sidon, but history knows them by the name given to them by the Greeks, Phoenicians. Close your eyes and try to feel the wonderful world that existed 3,000 years ago. A narrow strip of fertile land, no wider than 100 kilometers, stretches along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. On one side, boundless blue waters going beyond the horizon to the place where, as the ancients believed, sea monsters dwell and lie the edges of the earth. On the other side were the majestic Lebanese mountains, wrapped in emerald green cedar forests, whose trunks rose up like the columns of a heavenly temple. It was a land of contrasts. There were no vast plains to graze huge herds, no mighty rivers to feed the vast fields of grain. But this land had something more precious. It faced the sea, and the sea became for its inhabitants not a frontier, but the beginning of endless possibilities. Imagine the dawn over these shores, the first rays of the sun painting the water golden, the light breeze bringing the smell of seaweed and distant lands, the silhouettes of ships returning from long journeys with holds full of wonders on the horizon. It was here, in this amazing land, that the civilization that the Greeks called thalassokratia, the power of the sea, was born. That word sounds almost like an incantation, doesn't it? Thalassocracy. You can hear the sound of the waves, the creaking of the masts, the whistling of the wind in the sails. The Phoenicians did not conquer lands with armies of foot soldiers, nor did they build empires by force of arms. Their empire was of a different kind. It was an empire of trade routes ports and colonies scattered all over the Mediterranean, like pearls on an invisible thread of sea roads. In those distant times, when Egyptian pharaohs were still dreaming of eternity in their tombs, and Assyrian kings were counting their conquests on clay tablets, Phoenician ships were already plowing the waters from Gibraltar to Cyprus. Their captains knew every wind, every current, every dangerous shoal in this vast sea world. They were the first to venture out into the open sea, not shying away from the shore, as all other seafarers of the time did. Imagine these people. They were not warriors used to settling disputes with the sword, nor were they priests who spent their days in prayer and ritual. They were merchants, but merchants of a special kind. Merchants, seafarers, diplomats, and discoverers at the same time. Their rulers were first and foremost captains, and their heroes were not those who won battles, but those who dared to sail further than anyone before, who discovered new lands and paved new trade routes. In their towns along the coast, life flowed with a peculiar rhythm. Early in the morning, when the air was still cool and moist, the harbors bustled with activity. Loaders were hauling amphorae of wine and olive oil, bales of cloth, ingots of metal. The air was filled with dozens of odors, tar with which the ships were soaked, spices from the Far East, leather which was processed in the workshops, and above it all, there was a peculiar fragrance, the slightly bitter smell of the sea, mixed with the scent of the cedar from which the ships were built. The most important of these cities were the three pearls of the Phoenician coast: Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. Each had its own face, its own character, its own role in this maritime empire. Byblos, whose name is forever associated with books and writing, was the oldest center of trade. Ships laden with Egyptian papyrus, the very material on which they wrote in ancient times, passed through its harbor. It was from here that the word Byblos spread around the world, giving us the words library and Bible. Sidon was famous for its craftsmen and artists. In its workshops, glass and metal products were created that impressed all who saw them with their beauty and elegance. The craftsmen of Sidon were able to make glass so clear and pure that it looked like frozen water, and so fine that you could read through it. Their secrets were passed down from generation to generation, from father to son. And some of these secrets remain a mystery to us. But the greatest of all Phoenician cities was Tyre, the proud sea capital, queen of the waves. Tyre was built on an island connected to the mainland only by a narrow causeway, making it virtually impregnable from the sea. Its harbors could accommodate hundreds of ships, and its fleet was the most powerful in the Mediterranean. It was from Tyre that the ships that first reached the Atlantic Ocean left, and it was the Tyrian navigators who founded many colonies that later became great cities. Let us enter mentally one of these towns at an hour when the sun is high above the horizon, but not yet blazing. The narrow streets wind between houses made of white limestone, which appears slightly golden in the sunlight. The houses huddle together, their flat roofs forming spin terraces where nets are dried, cloth is hung, grapes and olives are grown. The air is filled with sounds, the clatter of hammers in the workshops, the shouts of traders calling for customers, the laughter of children playing in the shadows of the houses. But the most amazing sight is when we get down to the harbor. Here, at the stone quays, ships of all sizes and shapes bob on the waves. There are light and fast ships for coastal navigation. There are heavy merchant ships with wide holds. There are military ships with sharp rams on the bow and rows of oars on the sides. But the most impressive are the large merchant ships that the Phoenicians called gaulos. These sea giants, up to 30 meters long, could take on board cargo weighing more than 200 tons. Their wide, almost round hulls were adapted for long voyages and the transport of large quantities of goods. Particularly impressive were their sails, huge sheets of cloth, often dyed purple. This color was more than just decoration. It was a symbol of the power and wealth of the Phoenicians. Purple was extracted from marine mollusks, and this process was so complex and expensive that purple cloth was valued at the weight of gold. To obtain just 1 gram of pure dye, up to 10,000 mollusks had to be processed. But the result was worth all the effort. Tyrian purple did not fade in the sun, but on the contrary, became brighter and more saturated over time. When such a ship hoisted its sails and sailed out into the open sea, it was a majestic sight. The purple sail, blown by the wind, burned in the sun like a huge jewel, and the ship, like a bird of the sea, confidently parted the waves, heading for distant shores. These ships were true masterpieces of shipbuilding, made of the best material available at the time, Lebanese cedar. The cedars of Lebanon were a legend, sung in ancient texts and songs. These mighty trees grew high in the mountains, where the air was clean and cool, even on the hottest days. Their trunks rose to a height of over 30 meters, and their wood had amazing properties. It was strong, light, and, especially important for shipbuilding, resistant to decay. Cedar resin had preservative properties, which made ships built from this wood practically eternal. The process of harvesting cedar was a real ritual. The loggers climbed high into the mountains, to a place where the air was so pure that every breath burned the lungs with cold. The sound of axes chopping the centuries-old trunks echoed through the gorges, and the scent of freshly cut cedar, mixed with the mountain air, created an unforgettable bouquet of odors. The huge logs were then lowered down the slopes using a system of ropes and blocks and transported to the coastal shipyards, where master shipwrights turned them into seagoing vessels. Phoenician shipbuilders were not just craftsmen, they were artists and engineers at the same time. Each ship was built not only as a means of transport, but also as a work of art. The bows of the ships were decorated with carved figures, most often images of horses symbolizing speed and nobility, or sacred symbols to protect the ship and its crew from the dangers of the sea. But the most amazing invention of Phoenician shipbuilders were their multi-decked warships, biremes and triremes. These ships, with 2 or 3 rows of oars, were true marvels of engineering. Imagine a ship more than 40 meters long, which accommodated up to 170 rowers, each of whom managed an oar more than 4 meters long. When such a ship was at full speed, the synchronization of the rowers' movements created a rhythm like the beating of a huge heart, and the ship glided through the water at a speed that seemed incredible for a ship of this size. Particularly impressive was the battering ram, the pointed metal bow of a ship capable of piercing the side of an enemy vessel at full speed. The art of steering such a ship required many years of training, and Phoenician captains were recognized masters of naval combat throughout the Mediterranean. But warships were only a small part of the Phoenician fleet. It was based on merchant ships, and it was trade that was the true vocation of this people. Phoenician merchants were not just carriers of goods. They were a link between civilizations, a bridge between different worlds and cultures. Trade for the Phoenicians was not just a way of making money. It was an art, almost a sacred craft, passed down from generation to generation. Imagine a Phoenician merchant standing on the deck of his ship in the pre-dawn silence. The light sea breeze plays with the folds of his clothes, colored in that famous purple that cost more than gold. His eyes are not greedy or avaricious, but something more: the excitement of a discoverer, the wisdom of a diplomat, and the calculation of a merchant who sees opportunities where others see only obstacles. The Phoenicians became the lifeblood of the ancient world, linking disparate civilizations not by conquest and war, but by exchange and trade. They carried cedar wood to forestless Egypt, where pharaohs dreamed of eternal tombs, and brought gold and papyrus from there. They brought silver from distant Spain, which they called Tarshish, and copper from sunny Cyprus. But their most mysterious and valuable commodity was tin, a metal they mined somewhere in the north, perhaps in the misty British Isles, where few dared to sail. But among all the goods the Phoenicians traded, there was one that brought them fame and fortune beyond all others. It was purple, a dye they extracted from sea shellfish in the waters off their coasts. The process of obtaining this dye was so complex and painstaking that it seemed almost alchemical. Imagine a shore dotted with shells, where fishermen carefully extract from each clam a tiny gland containing a precious liquid. This liquid is colorless at first, but when exposed to sunlight and air, it gradually takes on that unique hue that the ancients called the color of the blood of the gods. Thousands and thousands of small shells had to be collected and processed to produce just a few grams of dye. The air around the shellfish processing workshops was filled with the peculiar smell of the sea, mixed with scents that are difficult to describe in words, both pungent and alluring. The workers in the business stood over the vats for hours, stirring the thick liquid with wooden sticks, their arms painted in various shades of purple, from soft pink to deep purple up to their elbows. But the result was worth all the effort. The fabric, dyed with tire purple, had an amazing property. It not only did not fade in the sun, but became brighter and richer with time. This color became a symbol of power and divinity. In the Roman Empire, the right to wear clothes fully colored in purple belonged only to emperors, and senators could afford only a purple stripe on the toga. Even the word porphyra, meaning the purple robe of rulers, comes from a Phoenician root. But the Phoenicians were not only masters of purple. Their glassblowers created products that amazed contemporaries with their beauty and elegance. In the workshops of Sidon and other Phoenician cities were born vessels of such fineness that it seemed as if they were blown out of frozen air. The secret lay in the special sand, which the Phoenicians extracted at the mouth of the river Belus. This sand was so pure that the glass welded from it was as clear as rock crystal. Phoenician craftsmen invented many glass-making techniques that seemed like magic to their contemporaries. They knew how to make multicolored glass, creating intricate patterns of multicolored threads fused together. Their glass beads, shimmering in all the colors of the rainbow, were coveted from Spain to India. In remote corners of the world, where the echoes of civilization had barely penetrated, these little glass wonders were valued on a par with precious stones. Imagine a glass blower's workshop in the heat of midday. The air is shivering from the heat of the furnaces, where sand melts at a temperature of over 1,000 degrees, turning into a thick, glowing mass. The master, drenched in sweat, carefully takes a portion of molten glass on the tip of a long tube and begins to blow it out, forming the thin walls of the future vessel. Each movement requires precision and experience. The slightest mistake, and the work of many hours will turn into a pile of shards. But it was not only crafts that brought the Phoenicians fame. Their true vocation lay in the sea, in long voyages to uncharted shores. They were the first to venture beyond the familiar world of the Mediterranean, the first to pass through waters that other peoples considered the end of the world. Around the 11th century BC, Phoenician ships first traveled through the narrow strait between Europe and Africa, the same Hercules pillars that would later be called Gibraltar. For navigators of that time, it was a feat comparable to the first flight into space. Beyond the strait lay an unknown ocean, which the ancients called the Atlantic, the Sea of Atlas, that Titan who held the firmament on his shoulders. The waters of the Atlantic met the Phoenicians differently from the calm, almost homely Mediterranean Sea. Here there were tides that were unknown in their native waters. Here storms came with unprecedented force, and fogs could hide the ship for days. But the Phoenicians did not give up. They founded the city of Gadir on the Atlantic coast of Spain. The future Cadiz, one of the oldest cities in Europe, which still exists today. From here, from the Atlantic shores of Spain, Phoenician ships set out on even more daring voyages. A Carthaginian navigator named Himilcar took his ships northwards along the coasts of Europe to where it was said that there were lands rich in amber, the petrified tears of the sun. He may have reached the Baltic Sea, the amber shore from which the sunstone was spread throughout the ancient world. His brother, Gannon, chose the opposite direction. His ships traveled south along the west coast of Africa, where the sun burns mercilessly and the coasts are teeming with unseen animals. In his notes, Gannon tells of lands where people lived with wool like animals, rivers full of crocodiles, and mountains that burned at night. Perhaps they were volcanoes. But the most amazing of all Phoenician sea exploits was a voyage made about 600 years BC on behalf of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II. A small flotilla of Phoenician ships set out from the Red Sea with the seemingly impossible task of circumnavigating Africa and returning across the Mediterranean. It was the first circumnavigation of an entire continent in human history. 3 years this incredible voyage lasted. For 3 years, the Phoenician sailors sailed along unknown coasts, landed in unknown lands to replenish water and food supplies, even sowed grain, and waited for the harvest when food supplies ran low. They saw the sun rise not in the east, but in the north, as the ships rounded the southern tip of Africa. They encountered peoples with black skin and strange customs. They experienced storms in unknown seas. And when at last their battered ships entered the waters of the Mediterranean from Gibraltar, the world learnt that Africa was surrounded by water on all sides. But more importantly, mankind realized that there were no seas that could not be crossed, no distances that could not be traveled. The Phoenicians proved that the earth is bigger than it seemed, but not infinite, that the ocean is not the edge of the world, but the road to new worlds. Such voyages required not only courage, but also an accurate knowledge of navigation. Here again, the Phoenicians were pioneers. They were the first to learn to navigate by the stars on the high seas. Before them, navigators fearfully huddled on the shores, navigating by familiar capes and islands. The Phoenicians looked up to the sky and made the stars their guides. One star was especially important to them, the one we now call Polaris. The Phoenicians were the first to notice that this star hardly changes its position in the sky, while all the other stars slowly revolve around it. They gave it their name, and the Greeks, having learnt navigation from them, began to call it the Phoenician star. Imagine a Phoenician captain standing on the deck of his ship on a moonless night with nothing but black water and a star-studded sky. He looks up and finds, among the thousands of twinkling dots, the one that will show him the way home. Thanks to this discovery, the Phoenicians could sail at night, giving them a huge advantage over their competitors. While other seafarers waited for dawn to continue their journey, Phoenician ships sailed through the darkness, guided by the stars. This allowed them to deliver goods faster and be the first to enter new markets. But it was not only trade and navigation that brought the Phoenicians immortal fame. Their greatest gift to mankind was an invention that changed the course of history: the alphabet. Before the Phoenicians, writing was the preserve of a select few. Egyptian hieroglyphs, with their hundreds of complex characters, Mesopotamian cuneiform, with its intricate combinations. All this required years of study and was available only to priests and scribes. The Phoenicians, on the other hand, created something revolutionary: a system of writing in which each sign did not denote a word or syllable, but a simple sound. 22 signs could be used to write any word in any language. It was a writing system for the people, for merchants and craftsmen, for anyone who wanted to record their thoughts or the conduct of their business. Imagine a Phoenician merchant keeping records of his transactions, sitting in the shade of a canopy on the deck of a ship. The papyrus rustles in the wind. The reed pen squeaks as he writes out simple, clear signs. Each letter is born from the movement of a hand accustomed to precision, the same precision that is needed when navigating the stars or weighing precious goods. The Phoenician letters were not just abstract symbols. Each of them kept the memory of the object they once represented. The letter Aleph came from the image of a bull's head. Bet, from a picture of a house. Gimel, from the figure of a camel. It was a writing that grew out of life itself, out of the daily experience of a people who were accustomed to calling things by their proper names. The Phoenician alphabet was written from right to left and had no vowels, only consonants. The vowels had to be worked out by the reader based on the context and knowledge of the language. This may seem inconvenient, but in fact, such a system had its advantages. It was more universal, allowing words of different languages to be written in the same characters. This alphabet spread around the world as fast as Phoenician ships traveled the seas. The Greeks borrowed it and added signs for vowel sounds, creating an alphabet in the modern sense of the word. From the Greeks, writing passed to the Romans, and from the Romans to all the peoples of Europe. The Arabs, Jews, and Arameans all created their own writing systems based on the Phoenician alphabet. And today, as we write these lines, we are benefiting from the legacy of those ancient seafarers who 3,000 years ago bobbed on the waves of the Mediterranean Sea. Every letter we see on the page or screen traces its lineage back to Phoenician signs carved in stone or inked on papyrus in a time when the world was young and full of undiscovered mysteries. Trade inevitably led the Phoenicians further and further away from their native shores, and soon mere trading posts were not enough. There was a need for permanent settlements, safe harbors where ships could wait out storms, replenish water and food supplies, and repair sails and hulls after a long voyage. Thus began the great era of Phoenician colonization, not conquest by force of arms, but peaceful settlement throughout the Mediterranean. Imagine a Phoenician captain who, after many weeks of sailing, finds a convenient bay with fresh water and fertile land. He lands on the shore, feels the solid earth under his feet after the rocking, breathes in the fragrance of unfamiliar herbs and flowers. Here one can build a wharf, warehouses for goods, houses for merchants. Here you can create a new home, a new city that will become a link in the great chain of Phoenician settlements that stretched from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Phoenician colonization was special. It was not a migration of farmers in search of new arable land, as with the Greeks, nor was it military conquest, as with the Romans. The Phoenicians founded their colonies at key points along trade routes, where sea routes intersected, where ships naturally stopped for rest and resupply. Their colonies were like pearls strung on the invisible threads of the sea lanes. The first wave of colonization began as early as the 12th century BC, when Phoenician seafarers set up their first settlements in distant lands after venturing beyond their home waters. In North Africa, they built Utica, a city whose name means ancient, and indeed it was one of the oldest Phoenician settlements outside the homeland. On the Atlantic coast of Spain came Gadir, the future Cadiz, which became the gateway to the ocean for the entire ancient world. The islands also attracted the Phoenicians because of their strategic position. In Sicily, they founded Motia, Panormos, and other cities that controlled the sea routes between Africa and Europe. Sardinia, Malta, Cyprus, wherever the sea met the land, wherever a convenient harbor could be built, Phoenician settlements sprang up. But among all the Phoenician colonies, there was one that was destined to surpass the glory and power even of its native cities. It was Carthage, Carth Hadach, meaning new city. Its foundation is shrouded in legends, and the most beautiful of them tells of the Princess Elissa, whom the Romans would later call Dido. The story begins in Tyre, in the royal palace, where the air was scented with incense and the quiet voices of the courtiers. Elissa was the sister of the king of Tyre, but after her brother's death, her new ruler threatened her life. So the princess decided to flee, taking with her faithful companions and some of the king's treasures hidden in the folds of her clothes and in the secret compartments of the ship. Elissa's ships wandered the sea for a long time, looking for a place to make a new home. Then, one day, as the sun was setting, coloring the water golden, they saw the coast of North Africa, a hilly land with comfortable bays and fresh water. Elissa landed on the shore and asked the local ruler to sell her land to establish a city. The king agreed, but on the condition that she could have as much land as she could fit inside the bull's skin. Elissa accepted the condition, but showed the cunning that has always characterized Phoenician traders. She had the ox hide cut into thin strips and joined them into one long rope. With this rope, she circled a large hill by the sea and obtained a tract of land sufficient for the building of a whole city. According to legend, Carthage was founded in the 8th century BC. The real story of its origin was, of course, more prosaic. A group of Tyrian colonists chose this place because of its strategic advantages. Carthage was located on a peninsula far out to sea, making it easily defensible from land. It had a convenient harbor, fresh water, and fertile land inland. Gradually, Carthage grew and grew rich. When in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Phoenician homeland was hit by waves of conquest, first by the Assyrians, then by the Babylonians, then by the Persians, Carthage assumed the role of leader of the western part of the Phoenician world. From the younger brother of Tyre, it developed into a mighty power capable of competing with the great empires. The harbor of Carthage was a marvel of engineering. It consisted of 2 artificial harbors connected by a narrow channel. The outer harbor, rectangular in shape, was intended for merchant ships. It was always bustling with activity. Merchants from different countries were unloading goods, repairing ships, making deals. The air was filled with the shouts of the movers, the creaking of blocks and ropes, the smells of resin, spices, and the sea. But the true jewel of the harbor was the inner military harbor, Khotan. It was circular in shape and surrounded by covered docks that could accommodate over 200 warships. In the center of the harbor was an island on which the admiralty and the arsenal were located. This entire harbor was strictly classified. Strangers were forbidden not only to enter it, but even to approach it. From the seaside, the entrance to Khotan was hidden by high walls so that no one could see how many ships were inside. Imagine this amazing harbor at dawn, when the first rays of the sun illuminate the masts and sails of hundreds of ships. The water surface is covered with light ripples reflecting the golden light. The air is still cool, and a light mist rises from the water. Somewhere, the oars of the patrol boats on duty are creaking, and the muffled voices of sailors can be heard, preparing the ships for going to sea. But Carthage was more than just a port and trading center. It was a city with a rich spiritual life, where ancient beliefs and new influences were intertwined. Phoenician religion was complex and multifaceted, reflecting both its connection to the sea and its ancient roots. The supreme deity of the Phoenician pantheon was El, the creator of the universe, the father of gods and men. His name sounded in the prayers offered by seafarers on their long voyages. But in everyday life, more important were the gods who directly influenced the fate of people. Baal, the Lord, the god of storms and fertility, whose favors were sought by farmers and sailors. Astarte, the great mother goddess, patroness of love, fertility, and war, who was honored in Carthage under the name of Tinnitus. A special place in the Phoenician pantheon was occupied by Melkart, the Tyrian patron god, protector of seafarers and founder of colonies. The Greeks identified him with Heracles, and indeed, many of the feats of the mythical hero, from traveling for the Golden Fleece to the founding of cities at the ends of the earth, resemble the deeds of Phoenician seafarers. The temples of Melkart stood in all Phoenician colonies, and seafarers made sacrifices to him before setting sail, asking for protection on the long journey. Phoenician temples were not like the grand structures of Egypt or Greece. They were more like sacred groves and elevated open-air places where altars were placed among ancient trees. The air in such places was filled with the aroma of burnt incense, myrrh, frankincense, cassia. The smoke of sacrifices rose to the sky, carrying with it the prayers and requests of the believers. But the Phoenician religion had a dark side that horrified even their contemporaries. These were human sacrifices, especially child sacrifices, which were offered in times of great calamity or at the founding of new cities. Archaeologists have discovered in Carthage and other Phoenician cities special sacred precincts, tophets, where urns with the ashes of sacrificed infants were kept. These places were shrouded in dark mystery. Imagine a sacred grove on the outskirts of the city, with rows of stone steles between ancient trees. Under each stele is buried an urn with ashes, and on the stone is carved an inscription, a dedication to Baal Haman, or Tinit. The air here is special, quiet, solemn, filled with a sense of the presence of something more than human understanding. Ancient authors, enemies of Carthage, described these rituals in gloomy colors. How children were burned alive in the arms of a red-hot bronze statue. How their screams were drowned out by the sounds of flutes and drums. Modern scholars suggest that in reality, the children were killed before being consigned to the flames, but the essence of the ritual did not become less tragic. This custom probably dates back to ancient times, when people believed that the gods demanded the most expensive sacrifices in return for their patronage. In Carthage, such sacrifices were widespread, especially in times of danger, during wars, epidemics, and crop failures. Parents believed that by sacrificing their child, they would save the city and ensure prosperity for the other children. But with the passage of time, this cruel custom was gradually softened. In the late period of Carthage's history, child sacrifices were increasingly replaced by animals, lambs, goats. And after the Roman conquest, the tradition was finally eradicated. The tophetes were deserted, their steles covered with moss, and only archaeologists many centuries later were able to tell the world about this dark page of Phoenician history. But it would be unfair to judge the Phoenicians on this aspect of their religion alone. After all, human sacrifice was practiced by many peoples of antiquity, and the Phoenicians gave the world far more light than darkness. Their ships carried not only goods, but also knowledge, ideas, and cultural traditions. Their alphabet opened writing to all peoples. Their navigation expanded the boundaries of the known world. The Phoenician cities were bustling with life, full of color and sound. In the markets, traders offered goods from all over the world, silks from distant China, spices from India, amber from the northern seas, gold from Africa. Craftsmen worked in the workshops whose products were famous all over the Mediterranean. Ships flying the flags of different countries docked in the harbors, and the air was filled with speech in dozens of languages. Phoenician women enjoyed more freedom than their sisters in other ancient civilizations. They could own property, engage in trade, and participate in religious ceremonies. Many accompanied their husbands on trading expeditions, and Phoenician colonies were often founded by whole families, not just male colonists. Children in Phoenician families received a practical education. Boys were taught about the sea, trade, and crafts. They knew how to read the stars, how to determine the quality of goods, how to negotiate with strangers. Girls were taught to run a household, but also the basics of trade. For a Phoenician merchant's wife had to be able to manage the business in her husband's absence. Phoenician houses were built for comfort in the hot Mediterranean climate. Flat roofs served as terraces, where families spent cool evenings gazing at the sea and the stars. The inner courtyards protected from the heat and kept the air cool. The walls were decorated with frescoes depicting sea scenes, exotic animals, flowers, and fruits. The food of the Phoenicians reflected their links with the sea and distant lands. Fish and seafood, supplemented with vegetables, fruit, olive oil, and wine, were the mainstay. But on the tables of wealthy merchants could be found rare spices from the east and strange fruits from distant lands. The Phoenicians were among the first to learn how to preserve fish in salt, which allowed them to take provisions with them on long voyages. But even the mightiest civilizations do not last forever, and the Phoenician domination of the seas was destined to collide with a force that rewrote the entire history of the Mediterranean. In the west of Italy, among the hills of Latium, grew a city that at first seemed only one of many: Rome. Its inhabitants were farmers and warriors, men of land to whom the sea had long been a foreign element. But the Romans had a trait that distinguished them from all other peoples of antiquity. They never gave up. Imagine a moment in history when two great powers, the maritime empire of the Phoenicians and the land power of Rome, came face to face. It happened in the 3rd century BC, when Roman legions first set foot on Sicily. The island was a bone of contention, too important, too rich to be owned by any one person. Sicily controlled the sea routes between Africa and Europe, and whoever ruled here ruled over the entire western Mediterranean. Thus began the First Punic War, the first of 3 great conflicts that stretched for nearly a century, from 264 to 146 BC. The word Punic comes from the Latin name for the Phoenicians, puns And these wars were the final chapter in the history of the great maritime civilization. The word Punic is derived from the Latin name for the Phoenicians, puns. And these wars were the final chapter in the history of a great maritime civilization. At first, it seemed that the Romans had no chance. The Carthaginian navy had controlled the seas for centuries. The Carthaginian admirals knew every wind, every current, every dangerous shoal. Their ships were faster, more maneuverable, their crews more experienced. When the Carthaginian triremes, with their sharp battering rams and 3 rows of oars, appeared on the horizon, few ships dared to take the fight to them, but the Romans had a remarkable ability to learn from their enemies. When a storm threw a Carthaginian ship onto the Italian shore, Roman craftsmen studied its construction down to the smallest detail. In a matter of months, they built an entire fleet on the Carthaginian model. But the Romans added something of their own, a marvelous invention called the Raven. It was a movable boarding platform with a hook at the end, which could be lowered onto the deck of an enemy ship and firmly bind the ships together. The sea battle turned into a land battle, where the Roman legionaries, the best infantrymen of the ancient world, had the advantage. Imagine this moment: 2 ships bound together by the iron embrace of the Raven, and Roman soldiers in red cloaks with swords at the ready run across the narrow bridge, turning the deck of the enemy ship into a battlefield. The first war lasted 23 years and ended with the defeat of Carthage. The Phoenicians lost Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, islands that had been their strongholds for centuries. But the hardest blow was that they had to pay a huge retribution and limit the size of their fleet. The sea lords of the world felt the bitterness of defeat for the first time. However, the spirit of Carthage was not broken. A new generation grew up in the city who remembered its former greatness and dreamed of revenge. Among them was a boy named Hannibal, son of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca. When Hannibal was only 9 years old, his father brought him to the altar and made him swear an eternal hatred of Rome. This oath determined the entire future fate of Hannibal and Carthage and Rome itself. Hannibal grew up in Spain, where the Carthaginians had created a new empire to make up for their losses in the Mediterranean. Here, among the Iberian mountains and valleys, he learnt the art of war, learned to understand people of different tribes and nations, and learnt what would later make him one of the greatest generals in history: the ability to unite different people with a common goal. When Hannibal was 26 years old, he became commander-in-chief of the Carthaginian armies in Spain. And then he made a decision that shocked the ancient world. Instead of waiting for the Romans in Spain or sailing to meet them by sea, he decided to attack Rome from where no one was expecting him. from the north, across the Alps. Imagine this incredible expedition. 90,000 infantry, 12,000 horsemen, and 37 war elephants. A huge army, speaking dozens of languages and following their young commander across half of Europe. They crossed the Pyrenees, traveled through Gaul, forded the Rhone, and came to the Alps, those formidable mountains which the Romans considered an insurmountable natural fortress. The crossing of the Alps became legendary during Hannibal's lifetime. Imagine narrow mountain paths where one man can barely walk, and a whole army with wagons and elephants moving along them. Imagine snowstorms, rock slides, attacks by mountain tribes. In 15 days of traveling, the army had lost almost half of its personnel, but what was left was hardened in the crucible of adversity and ready to do anything for its leader. When Hannibal descended into the valleys of northern Italy, the Romans could not believe their eyes. An enemy had appeared where his presence seemed impossible. And this enemy was not only numerous, but was led by a commander of genius. Hannibal won one battle after another, at Trebia, at Lake Trasimeno, and finally at Cannae in 216 BC. He defeated the Romans in such a way that it became synonymous with military disaster. At the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal used a tactic that military men still study today. He lured the Roman legions into a trap, surrounded them, and destroyed an army almost twice his size. 70,000 Romans died on the battlefield, including the consul and most of the senators on the campaign. It seemed that Rome was doomed, but the Romans again showed the trait that made them invincible. They did not give up. Instead of negotiating peace, they began to prepare for an even more bitter war. They used the same tactics against Hannibal that the Phoenicians had used against their enemies for centuries. Instead of direct confrontation, they avoided decisive battles by wearing down the enemy, attacking his communications, cutting him off from reinforcements. Hannibal spent 15 years in Italy, won almost all the battles, but could not achieve the main thing: to force the Italian cities to lay off from Rome. The Roman Confederation was stronger than he had hoped. Meanwhile, the Romans moved the war to Spain, where the young commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the one who would later be called African, recaptured all the Carthaginian possessions. The finale came in the year 202 BC in the African desert, near the city of Zama. Here, Hannibal, recalled from Italy to defend his hometown, met Scipio in a final battle. The two greatest generals of their time met in a duel that would decide the fate of the Western Mediterranean. The Battle of Zama was not only a clash of armies, but also a contest of wits. Scipio had learnt Hannibal's tactics and managed to turn them against him. The Carthaginian elephants, instead of crumpling the Roman ranks, were turned to flight and trampled their own infantry. The Carthaginian cavalry, which had always been the strong point of Hannibal's army, was defeated by the Numidian horsemen who had defected to Rome. The defeat was complete and final. Carthage lost all its possessions outside Africa. Its fleet was reduced to 10 ships, and the city was levied a contribution to be paid for 50 years. The great maritime empire had become a small African state under a Roman protectorate. But even this did not satisfy the Romans. For too long, Carthage had been their rival, and too much blood had been shed in the wars between them. In the Roman Senate, the words of Marcus Porcius Cato were increasingly heard. Carthage must be destroyed. He said these words at the end of every speech, no matter what he was talking about taxes, about roads, about all matters of state. And the Romans found an excuse for a new war. When the Carthaginians, driven to desperation by the raids of the neighboring king Massinissa, began hostilities without Rome's permission, it was declared a breach of the peace treaty. The Third Punic War began in 149 BC. But it was no longer a war, but an execution. The Roman army, under the command of Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the victorious Hannibal, laid siege to Carthage. For 3 years this siege lasted. For 3 years the inhabitants of the city resisted, hoping for a miracle that never came. They melted jewelry to make weapons. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings. Their food was leather, rats, human corpses. In the spring of 146 BC, the Romans invaded the city. 6 days of slaughter continued in the streets of Carthage. Houses burned. The inhabitants died under the rubble or by the swords of the legionaries. 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city was razed to the ground, and the place where it stood was cursed and salted so that nothing would ever grow on it. Thus ended the history of Carthage, and with it the history of Phoenician civilization as an independent power. Rome became the sole master of the Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans began to call our sea, Mare Nostrum. But it would be wrong to think that with the fall of Carthage, all Phoenician heritage disappeared. The Phoenicians gave too much to the world for their contribution to be wiped out by a single military disaster. Their alphabet continued to live and evolve, becoming the basis of writing for new nations. Their trade routes did not disappear. They were now navigated by Roman ships. Their cities continued to exist under new names and new authority. But most importantly, the Phoenicians left the world with an idea. The idea that the sea does not divide, but connects. That trade is better than war. That different peoples can live in peace and mutual enrichment. They showed that it is possible to be great, not by conquering lands by force of arms, but by creating ties between people for mutual benefit. Phoenician navigators were the first to realize that the earth is bigger than it seems, but not infinite. That beyond the horizon lay not the edges of the world, but new lands inhabited by people with whom they could learn and trade. They expanded the world for all who came after them. When we read a book today, we are using their invention. When we see a ship in the harbor, we see the fulfillment of their dream of sea roads. When we study a map of the world, we see the coasts they were the first to chart on their primitive maps. The Phoenicians taught humanity that the world is big and beautiful, that there is room for everyone, and that the best way to experience it is to go to sea and set sails to the wind. On quiet evenings, when the sun sets behind the horizon and the sea is as calm as a mirror, you can almost hear their voices, the sound of oars, the creak of ropes, the captain's commands. Somewhere out there, beyond the boundaries of the visible, ships under purple sails are still sailing along the sea roads laid 3,000 years ago, carrying treasures not of gold and silver, but of knowledge and discovery. The Phoenicians are gone, but they remain with us in every letter we write, in every ship that goes to sea, in every discovery that expands our understanding of the world. They remain in our dreams of distant lands and uncharted shores, in our desire for knowledge and adventure. And today, when our world has become global, when ships and planes connect continents, when information is instantly transmitted across oceans, we understand especially clearly that the Phoenicians were not just an ancient people. They were the forerunners of our time, the pioneers of globalization, the people who first understood that the world is one and that we are all passengers on one big ship called Earth. Good night, my dear listeners. May you dream of the purple sails of Phoenician ships sailing across the blue waves towards the rising sun. See you again on our nightly journeys through time and space, where each story is an invitation to reflect on how amazing and beautiful our world is.